Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Cindy Malinek. I'm the Director and Chief Curator at the museum, and we're so happy to have you here this evening for our film screening, Journey Proud Alabama Pottery. We've got an esteemed guest that will be up in just a couple of minutes to set the context, and then he'll be back up after the screening. I said to Joey tonight, it's the first time I've met him, but I feel like I know him because I watched this film traveling last summer on the airplane and was completely enthralled and made all kinds of notes about things I wanted to ask him questions about. But this is one of the engagement opportunities that the museum is offering in conjunction with our Alabama Pottery exhibition. So we're delighted that you're here. And I'll just tell you a little bit about our guest tonight and then ask him to come up and say hello and kick the evening off. So Joey Brackner is with us tonight. I'll mention that he's the author of a book from 2006 about Alabama pottery, and we have a few copies, and he's willing to sign them tonight. I may have to be one of the ones to grab, but I'll hold back in case family holds back sometimes. So know that he's here, and he's happy to sign books. But Joey is the manager of the Alabama State Council on the Arts Folk Life Program, and the director, I love this title, the director of the Alabama Center for Traditional Culture. He has a BA in anthropology from UAB, and then he holds a master's in anthropology as well from UT at Austin. So he's quite esteemed, quite beloved in this state. He's been a humanities scholar in residence, another amazing position to hold at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and it's our pleasure to have him tonight and all of you. So please welcome Joey Brackner.
Well, really the only thing I'll say before we watch this piece is this is one episode of Journey Proud. And a lot of people see me if they watch Journey Proud. This is the 37th episode of Journey Proud, and so they think I work for APT. And I would be honored to work for APT, but I don't. I work for the State Arts Council, which is fun because then I get to go on the road with APT and we have a great time. And with public broadcasting, my agency is primarily a grants-making organization. And with public broadcasting, if you are funding a program that will be on APT or PBS, you're not allowed to have any direction in its production. That's one of the rules. So as a consequence, the State Arts Council, one of the bigger arts funders in the state, doesn't fund Journey Proud. But their contribution is me. And so I work as part of my job for Journey Proud. This is the only hour-long Journey Proud piece. For 4 years, we made 9 episodes a year, 9 30-minute episodes a year. And that was kind of crazy and a lot of fun. And the director, my producer and main director, Chris Holmes, said, well, you know, you're a pottery scholar, so we've got to do a show on pottery. We didn't know how many more of these we would make. And he said, let's do one that's slow down, do just one this year, let it be an hour long, and be a lot more intentional about camera angles and this, that, and the other. So that is what this is. And I'll come back afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you. So, you know, I guess it's the danger of knowing too much about a subject that you're trying to cram a lot of information in. And even in doing that, you know, we left a lot out. But as you notice, we managed to get all the potters that we talked to in the film, except for the Rutledges, to come to this little gathering in Cleburne County. The people who collect Alabama pottery, and there are some in this audience, they have created a lot of interest over the last 30 or 40 years. And they've created these little pottery gatherings. The Cleveland County gathering is just one. They're, every other year or so, they have one in Randolph County at Wedowee. Almost every year there's a Sand Mountain Pottery Show in Albertville. Every once in a while there's a Northwest Alabama Pottery Show. It's been in Hamilton. We had a symposium at the Tennessee Valley Art Association in the bicentennial year, and that's in Tuscumbia. So, you know, and these people get together. Sometimes they're potters. Usually they're collectors. Sometimes they're descendants of potters. At this particular one, we had a family from Texas, the Rushtons, whose family made pottery in Randolph County, Alabama, and in Rusk County, Texas, and they had examples of both kinds of pottery at this Cleveland County show, so it was very cool. But anyway, do y'all have any questions about this TV show or pottery making? Or two of Barry's former students were in the shot firing at Fairhope. Nick Cantrell, the guy I met with the goatee, and his wife Maya Bloom were both active in that Fairhope firing scene. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you know, I realize you mentioned a lot of times that people collect this. You know, it reminds me of people who collect paintings and actually have their own private gallery. And so I guess there must be individuals throughout the state that want to collect this because it's their passion artistically.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, and the other thing I wondered about is, obviously they're so beautiful, so you can obviously enjoy the beauty of these. Do they still try to use the pots or vessels to store things, or is there a utilitarian aspect to it and not just the aesthetic?
Many of the pottery collectors that I know, and myself included, I mean, I use some pieces of pottery in a utilitarian way that are older than I am. But usually the older the pieces or the more valuable the pieces, people will not use them, you know. And, you know, the pottery collectors in the state by far have the most pottery. I mean, I would say the show out there are quite a few pieces, Dennis, they're still in private hands. And every time I've curated a show of pottery, to show really, and I curated a very large show that was here 10 years ago. I can't remember, 60, 70 pieces of pottery, and almost all of that was not from institutional collections, because the collectors have been so discriminating and so scholarly, really, and have in fact themselves produced research on the subject. So and it's in their hands for the most part. But of course now collecting, I can't afford to collect, you know, the very rare pieces of pottery. You get surgeons and you know, people who can afford that kind of thing. There's a surgeon in South Carolina that bought a Randolph County figural just 2 years ago, and I can't believe that he outbid the Alabama collectors and the Alabama museums, but he did. So it's you know, it's, but you know, it's they're collectors. You can barely walk in their houses for the pottery. Every flat surface has a pot. Every piece of furniture has been altered to have shelves for pots. It's incredible. And I don't have that at my house, but you know, it is amazing. I love to go play. They have their own study collections, basically. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, does it vary amongst the potters when they dig raw clay, like in those areas? How much processing happens before they throw pots of that, and does it vary from person to person?
I think it varies a lot. I don't think Zach does as much processing as the millers. The millers, you saw their big, giant gears on their mud mill. What happened, they know their clay source, the millers, because their family's been using it for about 150 years. And so they have a sense of of the right mixture of clay for a low-fired piece like a flower pot versus something that's churned clay, as he talked about. So they do a good bit of processing, and that they just, and it's not, it's been a lot of trial and error. They don't want that many surprises. That's why they don't like the ash glaze as much as other people, because it's unpredictable. Zach is all about surprises. He's hoping for a good surprise. He knows the variables involved, but he can't control them completely. And for him, that's part of the fun, part of the challenge. He's trying to pull a glaze out of his clay body some kind of way, and he loves it when the surface treatment is different on different parts of the pot. That would drive Eric Miller crazy. So, you know, there's a different aesthetic, and there are different reasons why you might want to process. And the potters in the audience might have some additional thing to say about that. But utilitarian potters in the old days, they used the ash glaze because they had to. They didn't have a choice. As soon as they could use the Albany slip, the brown jug, very chocolatey looking thing, they loved it because there was no drama. They didn't want any, you know, weird glaze thing that a wife would not want in her home, you know. They were totally about the business, and it was very predictable, very foolproof. But what the collectors want are the salt glazes and the ash glazes, because physically they're beautiful. They're not homogeneous. There's just a lot to look at in texture and color and sheen and everything. So.
I was just going to ask about Zach's not using glazes, how that, I mean, are the pots, will they hold water?
They will actually. Zach doesn't make a lot of utilitarian pottery, but he makes a lot of coffee mugs. I mean, he makes a ton of coffee mugs and also tumblers. And they do hold liquid. Now, if you sat liquid in it for a long, long time, it might seep through. But he usually sells the ones where there's some kind of glazing that happens on the interior where the liquid is. I have several of his coffee cups, and we drink out of them all the time. So yeah, it works. He's firing at a fairly high temperature. So, yes.
Joey, I know for a long time Alabama potteries had a kind of inferiority complex because there was so much more renown of North Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina potteries, and collectors view them, and even a lot of collectors buy pots that are obviously made in Alabama,
Yeah.
and rename them as Georgia pots.
Right.
Of course, your book had a lot to do with raising knowledge about our indigenous potteries. Do you see over the last, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years, much more pride and
Oh, yeah.
what's going on here and this speaking?
Right. I think the thing was that scholars took on those pottery industries earlier than we did in Alabama. And people were writing about Edgefield pottery in the 1960s. That's recent, but for 19th century American craft research, that's when it started in the 70s as well. And when I was in grad school, I was in Texas at the time, and really one of the key people that started that whole study of American stonewares happened to be in San Antonio, and she helped me with my master's thesis, but she said, when you go back home to Alabama, you need to start researching pottery because we don't know anything about Alabama. And she had, when they built the George Wallace twin tunnels in Mobile, she had bought a couple of Alabama pieces from bottle diggers who would go behind the big machines and behind the archaeologists. You know, and the archaeologists were mainly interested in like the French period, or, you know, and this later 19th century stuff. They didn't know if it was from New York, from Europe, but she bought some of that. And I remember she had this beautiful salt glazed jug, and it had Bama City stamped on it with a cobalt flower painted on it. And so she figured has to be from Alabama. She thought it might have been from Tuscaloosa because she knew that Tuscaloosa at one time was the state capital, and she also knew from her historical research there were some northern potters that worked in Tuscaloosa in the early period, and that was a good theory. But when we started researching Alabama, we found out that Alabama City was the first name for what is now Fairhope. So that is Bama City. And plus, the stoneware was the color of a Caucasian skin, that pink-ish color. And you can go through Baldwin County now and see outbuildings made out of pink brick. That's Fairhope brick. You know, and people from lower Alabama know Fairhope brick. So it was just a matter. And now with the research that's been done on the certain jug towns that loved decorative pieces, a lot of people outside the state of Alabama collect Alabama pottery. Williamsburg is collecting Alabama pottery, and Mazda and all these places that collect early American art. So it's a good question, though. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
I just wanted to ask about Sand Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit more about.
So y'all know where Sand Mountain is. Anybody from Sand Mountain? You're from Sand Mountain? Yeah. So Sand Mountain is a low, it has a lot of sand, sandy soil, but it is a low but broad mountain in between the Coosa River system and the Tennessee River system in North Alabama. And there's several places along Sand Mountain that has really great clay. In fact, there's even a town called Kaolin in Jackson County, which is the most northeast county in the state of Alabama. And Sand Mountain runs from about Gadsden all the way up to like just below Scottsboro. So it's a huge area. What people call Sand Mountain pottery was made on the southeastern edge near Gadsden, near a little community called Duck Springs, by a group of potters who had been, of course, in Randolph County. And then after the war, the Civil War, those who survived the war lost a lot of potters. Potters were all men in the 19th century in Alabama. It was men's work. That changed later, but that was the case. Many of them were killed. Some fought for the Union. It's a very fascinating thing. What happened in Randolph County was there was a pottery owner. Both of his sons-in-law had fought for the Confederacy, but he was pro-Union. And he was brutalized by the Ku Klux Klan. This was in 1868. And so he left Randolph County. This is brand new information. The digitization of historical documents is wonderful, and the searchability. And just this year, there was a publication that had been digitized, published by the Reconstruction state government in Alabama about outrages committed by the Ku Klux Klan. And this potter was actually written up. We always wondered why they left Randolph County. Now we know. And they went up there and started making pottery. They were able to make a shinier pottery and very fine-grained pottery. I think they probably mixed in pulverized glass to get a shinier. But their pottery is extremely distinctive. So if you go on eBay and type in Sand Mountain pottery, you'll get some hits. It may not all be Sand Mountain pottery, and there's actually some websites you can look. It's beautiful pottery, and it became, because it's so distinctive, it was safer for collectors, not easier to identify than some other jug towns in Alabama. But that's the fun thing about this when you're collecting historic pottery, is arguing about what you think it is. And then later, you might actually find out. And so we keep gathering more and more information. It's a lot of fun. Other comments or questions?
This may have been addressed before I was able to come in, but Monroeville.
Yes.
There are a couple of very famous potters in Monroeville.
Right.
Was that part of your presentation?
Well, I know, well, Sam Williams is a friend,
Yes, that's what-
and he isn't very much influenced by older pottery. I just had to come up with some potters. The reason I chose Zach was that he actually came from a pottery making family, but they had lost pottery making for a few generations. And it was almost serendipitous that he would just all of a sudden decide to become a clay artist, you know, and his great-great-grandfather, I mean, they would have nothing in common. They would argue probably about everything, including pottery. But I just found that so fascinating, and the fact that Zach insists on using local clay. That's what you don't get with a lot of potters, even art potters today, because you really want to know the clay. So you want to buy a known quantity. But Zach and some of these other potters who are replicating older pots, they want to use the local clay. Contemporary potters call that wild clay because it's non-commercial clay. And I love that term, wild clay. But it's non-commercial clay, and then there's this element of surprise and unpredictability and frustration probably. But Sam's a great potter. We're good friends, and I would characterize him as a contemporary potter who's been very much influenced by the Alabama pottery tradition. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if some of the larger vessels in the show may have been hand-built instead of wheel-thrown.
In this show out here,
Yes.
I can't remember any that I would say would be hand-built. A lot of times when they, for example, that shaving mug, because it is asymmetrical, but I think they started from a turned, the traditional potters would call that turning versus throwing. They would turn that on a wheel. They did hand build some things, but not very many. They didn't really make pinch pots. They made some grave markers that were hand built totally, and I'm thinking not so much in Alabama but in other states they made wall pockets, basically a flat piece of clay with a cup-like addition, and those were hand built. But for the most part, we could go back there and look, but I'm not remembering anything back there that's not turned on a wheel. But they do a lot of finishing work with it, you know, smoothing up the sides. Sometimes glazes can distort things a little bit, but I would be surprised if there was anything back there that was at least, if not at least in its initial stage, turned on a wheel. For one thing, it's a good way to make the walls of the vessel thinner and the vessel itself lighter, because in the early period, you saw how big some of those vessels are. Once you fill those things up, they're very heavy. You don't want them to be any heavier than they have to be before they're filled up. And you also transported them in wagons, and you had to put them on, I mean, you know, so they were worried about the thinness. They weren't so much saying, I'm going to show what a great potter I am. They wanted a thin, light vessel before they filled it up with goods. So anyway, any other comments or questions?
What were the lids made of? Were they, well, I mean, a lot of the lids are gone.
Right. What were the lids made of? They made them of clay. They would just simply put a slab of clay on the wheel and turn it, cut it with a knife perhaps. If it's a churn lid, stick their thumb right in the middle to make a hole in it. But those lids broke. So often you see a replacement lid 50 years after the making of the vessel, 60 years, 70 years, made out of wood. And you'll see old churns with a wooden top, but that's a replacement top. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming, watching.